What if I told you that the man your boss mocked every single day for inheriting a worthless pile of bricks was actually sitting on a fortune worth $300 million? What if that same humble janitor who ate bologna sandwiches while his arrogant employer dined on lobster was about to become one of the wealthiest men in the state? This isn't just another rags to riches story. This is about how one man's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation led to the most shocking discovery that would silence his tormentors forever. Stay with me, because what happened next will make you question everything you think you know about judging people by their appearance. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the universe has the most incredible way of evening the score. Marcus Thompson had calloused hands that told the story of 37 years of hard labor. Every morning at 5:15, his worn-out Honda Civic would sputter into the parking lot of Meridian Industries, a sprawling manufacturing complex in Ohio where he worked as a maintenance supervisor. The engine would cough twice before finally giving up, and Marcus would pat the dashboard gently, whispering, "Thanks, old girl," like he was talking to a faithful friend who'd been by his side through thick and thin. His uniform was always pristine despite being 5 years old. Sarah, his wife, made sure of that. She'd press it every Sunday night while humming gospel songs, her way of sending love with him into another week of thankless work. The fabric had faded from navy blue to something closer to grey, but it was clean, and that mattered to Marcus. His work boots, resoled 3 times, squeaked slightly on the polished floors as he made his rounds, checking machinery, fixing what was broken, keeping the wheels of industry turning while remaining virtually invisible to those who profited from his dedication. The other workers respected Marcus. He was the guy you called when the conveyor belt jammed at 2 in the morning, when the heating system failed during a blizzard, when nobody else could figure out why that one machine kept making that awful grinding noise. He never complained, never asked for overtime pay he deserved, never spoke badly about anyone. His lunch consisted of the same thing every day: 2 bologna sandwiches Sarah made, a thermos of black coffee, and an apple that was usually bruised because they bought the discounted fruit at the grocery store. But Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity that no amount of financial struggle could diminish. When younger workers made mistakes, he'd guide them patiently, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades without making them feel stupid. When managers barked orders, he'd nod respectfully and get the job done, even when those orders made no sense. His co-workers often wondered how he maintained such grace under pressure, such kindness in the face of daily indignities that would break most men. At home, Marcus was a different kind of hero. His daughter Emma, 16 and brilliant, would wait for him every evening at the kitchen table, homework spread out like battle plans. He'd wash the grease from his hands and sit beside her, helping with math problems that reminded him of dreams he'd once had of becoming an engineer. Those dreams had died when his own father passed away unexpectedly, leaving Marcus to support his mother and younger siblings before he could finish college. But he never spoke of regrets, only of the joy he found in seeing Emma's eyes light up when a difficult concept finally clicked. Sarah would watch from the doorway sometimes, her heart swelling with love for this man who gave everything to everyone else and asked for nothing in return. They'd been married 18 years, and not once had she heard him complain about their circumstances. When the refrigerator broke, he'd fix it with parts from the junkyard. When the roof leaked, he'd climb up himself with materials bought bit by bit over several paychecks. Their house was small, but it was filled with laughter and love, and the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. The neighborhood where they lived told its own story. Modest homes with small yards where children played until streetlights came on. Neighbors who borrowed cups of sugar and returned casseroles when someone was sick. Marcus knew everyone on his block, would shovel snow from elderly Mrs. Patterson's driveway without being asked, would help young couples move furniture on weekends. He was woven into the fabric of this community like a thread that held everything together. On Sunday mornings, the Thompson family would walk 4 blocks to Mount Olive Baptist Church, where Marcus served as a deacon despite working 6 days a week. He'd tithe 10% of his modest salary without fail, believing that blessings shared would multiply. The pastor, Reverend Williams, often said that Marcus Thompson was living proof that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account, but by the size of his heart and the steadiness of his character. Yet none of this mattered to Richard Blackwood, the plant manager who seemed to take perverse pleasure in making Marcus's life difficult. Blackwood was everything Marcus wasn't: loud, arrogant, entitled and cruel. He'd inherited his position through family connections rather than earning it through hard work, and he wore his privilege like expensive cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. The first indication that Marcus's life was about to change forever came on a Tuesday morning in March, when the certified letter arrived. Sarah called him at work, her voice trembling with confusion and excitement. A law firm in Boston was requesting his immediate presence regarding an inheritance from a great-aunt he'd never met. The letter mentioned something about property and legal obligations, but the formal language was difficult to decipher. Marcus had never heard of Aunt Cordelia Ashford. His mother, when pressed for memories, vaguely recalled stories about a sister who'd married rich and moved east decades ago, cutting ties with the family after some long-forgotten dispute. She'd apparently died 3 months earlier, at the age of 93, and through some twist of legal procedure, Marcus had emerged as her sole heir. The trip to Boston required taking unpaid leave, something the family could barely afford. But Sarah insisted, selling her grandmother's wedding ring to cover the travel expenses. She had a feeling, she told Marcus, that God was about to move in their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Her faith had always been stronger than his, and he'd learned to trust her instincts about things that couldn't be explained by logic alone. The law office was intimidating. All marble floors and oil paintings and leather chairs that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Attorney Harrison Pemberton III looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit clearly custom-made. He treated Marcus with professional courtesy, but couldn't quite hide his surprise at this man's humble appearance. "Mr. Thompson," Pemberton said, sliding papers across a mahogany table that could have fed a family of 8. "Your great-aunt Cordelia has left you her estate in Beacon Hill. I must warn you, however, that the property hasn't been maintained in years. Mrs. Ashford became something of a recluse in her final decades, and the mansion, well, let's just say it's in considerable disrepair." The keys felt heavy in Marcus's palm, as if they carried the weight of history and possibility. Pemberton explained that the property taxes were current, paid automatically from a trust fund that would soon be depleted. After that, Marcus would be responsible for all expenses related to the estate. The implication was clear: this inheritance might prove to be more burden than blessing. But when Marcus first saw the mansion at 47 Beacon Hill, his breath caught in his throat. Even in its deteriorated state, the building was magnificent. 4 stories of weathered brick and limestone, with ornate cornices and tall windows that had once looked out upon one of Boston's most prestigious neighborhoods. The iron fence surrounding the property was rusted and broken in places, and the garden had become a jungle of overgrown ivy and weeds. The front steps were cracked, the paint on the massive oak door was peeling, and several shutters hung at odd angles like broken wings. But Marcus could see beyond the decay to the craftsmanship underneath. This house had been built by people who understood that beauty was worth preserving, that some things were meant to last for generations. The interior was even more overwhelming. Room after room of faded grandeur, with crystal chandeliers dim with dust, and hardwood floors scarred by decades of neglect. Furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts of better times. The wallpaper was peeling in most rooms, and there were water stains on several ceilings where the roof had leaked during countless storms. Marcus spent 3 days walking through the mansion, taking pictures to show Sarah and Emma, trying to process what this meant for their future. The house needed everything: new plumbing, electrical work, roof repairs, heating system replacement. The estimate from a contractor was staggering, easily $200,000 just to make the place livable. When he returned to Ohio, the reactions were swift and predictable. Sarah cried when she saw the photos, not from disappointment, but from amazement that something so beautiful could now belong to her family. Emma immediately began researching the history of Beacon Hill, discovering that their mansion had been built in 1887 by a railroad magnate and had housed some of Boston's most prominent families over the decades. But at work, the news of Marcus's inheritance became a source of endless entertainment for Richard Blackwood. The plant manager had overheard Marcus on the phone with a Boston contractor, and soon the entire facility knew about the worthless pile of bricks that Marcus had foolishly inherited. "Thompson!" Blackwood would bellow across the factory floor, his voice carrying over the noise of machinery. "How's your castle coming along? Fixed that leaky roof yet, or are you still living like royalty in your palace of dreams?" The other managers, desperate to curry favor with Blackwood, would join in the mockery. They'd stage elaborate conversations about Marcus's mansion, wondering aloud if he'd hired servants yet, or if he was planning to throw fancy dinner parties for all his high society friends. The cruelty was casual and constant, death by 1,000 cuts administered with smiles and laughter that felt like acid on Marcus's soul. Marcus endured it all in silence, his jaw tight, but his dignity intact. He'd learned long ago that responding to bullies only encouraged them, that the best revenge was living well, despite their attempts to break his spirit. But inside, each joke felt like a physical blow, especially because he knew they weren't entirely wrong. The mansion was a burden he couldn't afford, a beautiful dream that threatened to become a nightmare. The financial pressure was crushing. Marcus took on weekend construction jobs, his body aching from 7-day work weeks, but his determination unwavering. Sarah picked up extra shifts at the diner where she worked part-time, coming home with swollen feet and stories of difficult customers she served with the same grace her husband showed his tormentors. Emma started babysitting for neighbors, saving every dollar toward her college fund while watching her parents sacrifice everything for a house they might never be able to properly restore. The family meals became even simpler, and small luxuries disappeared entirely. But they never spoke of giving up, never discussed selling the mansion to escape the financial burden. During one particularly difficult week in June, when the plant's air conditioning failed and everyone was working in sweltering heat, Blackwood's cruelty reached new heights. He'd cornered Marcus in the break room, surrounded by an audience of snickering supervisors who were too cowardly to object but too spineless to walk away. "You know what I heard, Thompson?" Blackwood said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I heard that fancy house of yours doesn't even have working toilets." "Is that true? Are you living like a king in a palace without plumbing? Maybe you should have thought about that before accepting your generous inheritance." The laughter that followed was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting. Marcus looked up from his bologna sandwich, meeting Blackwood's eyes with quiet dignity that seemed to irritate the man even further. "It's a work in progress, Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said simply, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "A work in progress," Blackwood repeated, turning to his audience like a comedian working a room. "Did you hear that? The janitor's house is a work in progress. Tell me, Thompson, how does it feel to inherit a money pit? How does it feel to know you'll be working in this factory until you die, trying to pay for repairs on a house that should have been torn down decades ago?" Something flickered in Marcus's eyes then, something that might have been pity. "I suppose," he said quietly, That depends on what you consider wealth, sir. The response seemed to catch Blackwood off guard, and for a moment uncertainty crossed his features. But then his arrogance reasserted itself, and he laughed even louder. Wealth? Thompson, you're delusional. You're a maintenance worker who inherited a condemned building. That's not wealth. That's stupidity with a fancy address. Marcus finished his sandwich in silence, gathered his things, and returned to work. But those words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he went about his duties. What did he consider wealth? The love of his family, the respect of his neighbors, the satisfaction of work well done. Or was Blackwood right? Was he just a fool clinging to impossible dreams? That weekend, Marcus drove back to Boston alone, needing time to think without the weight of his family's expectations. He sat on the mansion's front steps as evening fell, watching well-dressed couples walk past on their way to dinner at expensive restaurants. They glanced at him with the kind of polite dismissal reserved for people who clearly didn't belong in their neighborhood. The house loomed behind him in the darkness, and for the first time since inheriting it, Marcus wondered if he should just walk away. The contractor's estimates kept growing. The property taxes were due in 6 months, and every day at work brought fresh humiliation. Maybe Blackwood was right. Maybe he was just a dreamer who'd bitten off more than he could chew. But as he sat there in the darkness, something caught his eye. A loose brick in the steps, shifted slightly by weather and time. Marcus's maintenance instincts kicked in, and he knelt to examine the damage. The mortar had crumbled away, leaving the brick unstable and dangerous for anyone climbing the steps. He worked it free with his hands, intending to make a temporary repair, but as the brick came loose, he noticed something odd. The space behind it was larger than it should have been, and there seemed to be some kind of metal surface reflecting the streetlight. Marcus pulled out his phone's flashlight and peered into the opening. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Behind the loose brick was a small metal box, green with age but intact. His hands shook as he worked it free from its hiding place, and when he opened the tarnished latch, his entire world shifted on its axis. Inside the box were papers. Old papers wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from decades of weather, bank documents from institutions that no longer existed, stock certificates from companies he'd never heard of, and a letter written in an elegant hand on letterhead that read, Ashford Investment Trust. Marcus read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated his consciousness. His great-aunt Cordelia hadn't been the eccentric recluse everyone believed. She'd been a brilliant investor who'd spent the last 30 years of her life building a financial empire while living like a pauper to avoid attention from gold diggers and distant relatives who might contest her will. The documents in that box represented holdings worth over $300 million. $300 million. Marcus had to sit down on the steps, his legs suddenly unable to support him as the magnitude of this discovery washed over him like a tsunami of disbelief. Stock portfolios, managed by the most prestigious firms in Boston, real estate holdings across New England, government bonds that had been quietly accumulating interest for decades. All of it hidden, all of it secret, all of it now legally his according to the will that had already been probated. The letter explained everything. Cordelia Ashford had never married, never had children, and had watched from a distance as her family forgot about her existence. She'd lived modestly in just 3 rooms of the mansion, letting the rest fall into disrepair as camouflage for her true wealth. The loose brick had been her safety deposit box, containing proof of assets that weren't listed in the public portion of her estate. If you're reading this, the letter concluded, then you've shown the kind of persistence and character that convinced me you were worthy of this inheritance. Don't let money change who you are, dear nephew. Use it to become who you were always meant to be. Marcus sat on those steps until dawn, holding papers that represented more wealth than he'd ever imagined possible. But along with the shock and excitement came a profound sense of responsibility. This money came with expectations, with the weight of his great-aunt's faith in his character. As the sun rose over Beacon Hill, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He wouldn't let this discovery change his essential nature, but he also wouldn't let Richard Blackwood's cruelty go unanswered. Justice, he realized, didn't always come from courts or committees. Sometimes it came from patience, dignity, and the universe's strange sense of timing. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks quietly liquidating enough assets to restore the mansion properly. He hired the best contractors in Boston, not to show off, but to honor his great-aunt's memory and create something beautiful for his family. The work was extensive but swift, and within 2 months, 47 Beacon Hill was transformed from a decrepit relic into a stunning example of Victorian elegance. But Marcus continued going to his job at Meridian Industries, enduring Blackwood's daily mockery with the same quiet grace he'd always shown. His co-workers noticed subtle changes. New work boots that didn't squeak, a newer Honda that started on the first try, a confidence in his bearing that hadn't been there before. But Marcus deflected questions about improvements in his situation, claiming he'd gotten a small loan to make basic repairs to the house. The truth was, Marcus was orchestrating something far more sophisticated than simple revenge. Through intermediaries and legal channels, he'd begun acquiring shares in Meridian Industries, not enough to raise suspicions, but enough to slowly build toward a controlling interest in the company that had employed him for 15 years. Sarah knew something had changed in her husband, but she trusted his judgment enough not to press for details. Emma noticed that her college fund had mysteriously grown, but when she asked about it, Marcus simply said that some investments had paid off better than expected. The family still lived modestly, still attended the same church, still maintained the same values that had guided them through years of struggle. But in Boston, the mansion was becoming the talk of Beacon Hill. Interior designers photographed rooms for architectural magazines. The garden, professionally restored to its original Victorian splendor, won awards from horticultural societies. Neighbors who'd once ignored the property now stopped to admire the transformation, wondering who had the taste and resources to accomplish such a remarkable restoration. Marcus would drive up on weekends, sometimes alone and sometimes with his family, walking through rooms that seemed too beautiful to be real. Emma had her own bedroom suite with a view of Boston Common, and Sarah had a kitchen that belonged in a magazine. But they still preferred their modest Ohio home during the week, still valued the community and relationships they'd built over years of shared struggle. The financial press began taking notice of unusual activity in various markets. Someone was making very smart investments, acquiring undervalued assets with the precision of a master strategist. But the mysterious investor remained anonymous, working through trusts and holding companies that revealed nothing about their true identity. Richard Blackwood, oblivious to the forces gathering around him, continued his campaign of cruelty with even greater enthusiasm. He'd heard rumors about improvements to Marcus's worthless mansion and interpreted them as signs of financial desperation. In his twisted logic, Marcus must be going deeper into debt to maintain appearances, which made him an even more satisfying target for ridicule. "Thompson!" Blackwood called out one morning in August, his voice echoing across the factory floor with its usual venom. "I heard you've been throwing money at that disaster you inherited. Tell me, how many credit cards did you max out to buy some paint and wallpaper? Are you planning to declare bankruptcy before or after you lose the house to foreclosure?" The gathered supervisors laughed on cue, but there was something different in the sound this time. A few workers had stopped their tasks to listen, and their faces showed disgust rather than amusement. Marcus's quiet dignity over the months had earned him respect that Blackwood's position couldn't command, and people were growing tired of the constant cruelty. Marcus looked up from the machinery he was repairing, his expression calm and thoughtful. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice carrying clearly over the factory noise, I think you'll find that some investments pay off in ways you might not expect. There was something in his tone that made Blackwood pause, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before, but the plant manager was too committed to his role as tormentor to back down now. Investments? He scoffed. Thompson, you're a janitor. What could you possibly know about investments? Marcus smiled then, an expression so peaceful and knowing that it made several people uncomfortable. I suppose we'll find out soon enough, he said simply, and returned to his work. That afternoon, Richard Blackwood received a call that would change his life forever. The board of directors was requesting his immediate presence for an emergency meeting. No explanation, no agenda, just an urgent summons that left him feeling uncertain for the first time in years. The boardroom was filled with faces he recognized, but the atmosphere was different somehow. Tense, expectant. At the head of the table sat a man Blackwood had never seen before, impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from real power rather than inherited position. Mr. Blackwood, the stranger said, his voice polite but firm, I'd like you to meet the new majority shareholder of Meridian Industries. Blackwood's confusion deepened. I wasn't aware the company was for sale. Who? It wasn't for sale, the man interrupted smoothly. Shares were acquired through various market transactions over the past several months, all perfectly legal, all properly documented. The new owner has some concerns about management practices and employee relations that need to be addressed immediately. As the implications began to dawn on him, Blackwood felt his world tilting off its axis. Who is this new owner? What do they want? The boardroom door opened, and Marcus Thompson walked in, still wearing his work uniform, but carrying himself with a dignity that commanded instant respect. He'd changed clothes after his shift, but deliberately chosen to wear his maintenance uniform to this moment of reckoning. Hello, Richard, Marcus said quietly, taking a seat at the table as every face in the room turned toward him with expressions ranging from shock to admiration. I believe we need to have a conversation about leadership and respect in the workplace. The silence that followed was deafening. Blackwood's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror as he realized what had happened. The man he'd tormented for months, the worthless janitor he'd mocked for inheriting a pile of bricks, was now his boss. This is impossible, Blackwood whispered, his voice barely audible. You're a maintenance worker. You can't possibly have the resources to acquire a controlling interest in a mid-sized manufacturing company, Marcus finished calmly. You're right, Richard. A maintenance worker couldn't. But sometimes people are more than they appear to be, and sometimes patience is more powerful than cruelty. Marcus stood up, and everyone in the room instinctively gave him their attention. This was a man who'd earned his authority through character rather than inheriting it through connections, and the difference was palpable. For 15 years, Marcus said, his voice steady and clear, I've watched this company succeed despite leadership that confused fear with respect, cruelty with strength. I've seen good people leave because they couldn't tolerate a toxic environment, and I've watched productivity suffer because employees were treated as disposable rather than valuable. He walked to the window, looking out at the factory floor where he'd spent so many years fixing what was broken. I didn't buy this company for revenge, Richard. I bought it because I believe in its potential and in the people who make it run. But that potential can't be realized under leadership that sees workers as targets for abuse rather than partners in success. Blackwood tried to speak, but Marcus held up a gentle hand that somehow carried more authority than any shout could have managed. You have a choice, Marcus continued. You can resign today with a generous severance package and a positive reference, allowing you to find a position better suited to your management style. Or you can stay and learn what real leadership looks like, starting with a sincere apology to every employee you've treated with disrespect. Doom. The humiliation was complete, but Marcus offered it with such grace that even Blackwood's allies in the room felt a grudging respect for the way he handled absolute victory. There was no gloating, no cruelty returned for cruelty received, just quiet strength and an opportunity for redemption that few people would have offered under similar circumstances. Blackwood looked around the room, seeing his former subordinates watching him with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to pity. He understood that his career at Meridian Industries was over, but he also recognized that Marcus Thompson was offering him a way to leave with some dignity intact. "I'll resign," he said finally, his voice hoarse with defeat and perhaps the first stirrings of shame for years of needless cruelty. Marcus nodded, his expression neither triumphant nor vindictive. "I hope you find a position where your talents are better utilized and where you can learn to see employees as people rather than targets. Everyone deserves the chance to grow and change." The transformation of Meridian Industries under Marcus's ownership became a case study in enlightened management. Wages increased, working conditions improved, and employee satisfaction reached levels that translated directly into higher productivity and profits. Marcus continued to work on the factory floor 1 day a week, maintaining his connection to the people who made the company successful. The mansion in Boston became a gathering place for family celebrations and community events. Marcus and Sarah hosted fundraisers for local charities, opened their home for tours that benefited historical preservation societies, and quietly funded scholarships for deserving students who might not otherwise afford college. Emma graduated valedictorian of her high school class and received a full scholarship to MIT, where she studied engineering just as her father had once dreamed of doing. But more importantly, she carried forward the values of dignity, kindness, and perseverance that had guided her family through years of struggle and sudden wealth. The story of Marcus Thompson spread far beyond the factory walls and Boston's social circles. Business schools taught cases about his management philosophy, and leadership conferences invited him to speak about the power of patience and character in achieving lasting success. But Marcus always insisted that his greatest accomplishment wasn't the wealth he'd inherited or the company he'd transformed. It was the family he'd raised and the community he'd served. Years later, when reporters asked him about the moment he discovered his inheritance, Marcus would smile and say that the real treasure hadn't been the money hidden behind that brick. It had been the lesson his great-aunt had taught him about the difference between having wealth and being wealthy, between commanding respect and earning it, between taking revenge and finding justice. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, found work with a smaller company where his new boss happened to be a woman who'd learned about management from leaders like Marcus Thompson. The experience was humbling but ultimately transformative, teaching him lessons about leadership that he'd never learned during his years of inherited privilege. The moral of Marcus Thompson's story isn't that good things come to those who wait, though patience certainly played a role in his journey. It isn't that wealth solves all problems, though financial security certainly made his family's life easier. The real lesson is about the power of maintaining your dignity in the face of cruelty, about treating others with respect, regardless of their position, and about understanding that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on the world around you. Marcus Thompson never forgot where he came from or what he'd learned during those years of struggle. He understood that his great-aunt's gift wasn't just money. It was the opportunity to prove that character matters more than circumstance, that kindness is stronger than cruelty, and that sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing when it comes to delivering justice. In the end, the man who'd been mocked for inheriting a worthless pile of bricks had discovered something far more valuable than $300 million. He'd learned that respect earned through character lasts longer than fear imposed through position, that dignity maintained under pressure is more powerful than revenge taken in anger, and that the greatest inheritance anyone can leave is the example of how to live with grace, purpose, and unwavering integrity. As Marcus often told his employees at company meetings, "We're not just building products here. We're building lives, families, and communities. Never forget that how we treat each other matters more than how much money we make, because at the end of the day, our character is the only thing we truly own." And in those words, spoken by a man who discovered that true wealth had nothing to do with bank balances and everything to do with the content of one's character, lay the real treasure that Cordelia Ashford had left her great-nephew, not just money, but the wisdom to use it well.